The Echo Chamber, brought to you by the Holmes Report and produced by the international broadcast specialist Marketeers. And sponsored by March Communications, connecting innovation and people.
Welcome to the Echo Chamber. I'm Aarti Shah, your host for today's episode that looks at the gender pay gap. So many of you know the Holmes Report conducted some research earlier this year that revealed a substantial pay gap across both gender and ethnicity for PR professionals in North America. And I'll include links to those show notes, a link to that story in the show notes for those of you who may have missed that. But essentially it confirmed what I think other studies have also shown, is that there is a pay gap does exist in our industry. So the timing of this podcast, of course, is on the back of that, but also there's a lot going on in this area from a policy perspective. I think it's April 2018, every organization in the UK that employs more than 250 people will have to start reporting any gender pay gap that exists there. Several U.S. cities have now outlawed the practice of asking prospective employees questions about their salary history. So we're going to dive into the ramifications for some of these policy initiatives, as well as why the pay gap continues to perpetuate when there seems to be so much awareness around the problem by now. So we'll have Angela Oakes, who is co-founder and joint president of the Global Women in PR organization, on in just a moment to have a conversation about this. Welcome to the show, Angela.
Hi.
So we are here to talk about gender pay gaps in the industry. And I first want to kind of give our listeners a little bit of context. Can you explain a little bit about the Global Women in PR, for which you're a co-founder, what it is, why it formed?
Okay. Yes. Myself and Susan Hardwick, we are the joint presidents and co-founders of Global Women in PR. And we were former presidents of Women in PR in the United Kingdom, which is a networking group and a sector group of the trade association there. And when we handed over our presidency about 4 or 5 years ago, we realized that we could take this idea on a international plane, because we felt that women in public relations was extremely good at connecting senior PR women around the world, and it offers members the opportunity to share ideas, experiences and resources. And we also provide insights and look carefully at key issues like gender pay and flexible work. So we have campaigning objectives, but we also are very much a supportive network of senior women in the industry. So we have been expanding in the last 2 years, Global Women in PR, and there are various chapters or groups now setting up around the world, including India, Germany, across Europe. So it's been a really exciting time, and I think it's a great concept, especially as we're now living in a global world, to help women in the industry.
Well, I was going to ask, because you all have done the research about the pay gap at least for 2 years. I know we see 2017. I know you did this in 2016. How long have you been doing that research?
Well, we only founded Global Women in PR 2 years ago. So we thought we would launch the survey last year globally, because then we can then use it to benchmark what happens and what's happening in the industry around the world. And then we can also try, when we raise the issues, to consider what the solutions might be. Because it's one thing highlighting the issue, and it's very widely reported that there's a gender pay gap in all industries, not just in the public relation industry. But we want to actually try and find solutions. And by working together, I think women in the industry can do that.
So Angela, before we get started, and of course, I mean, it's I hope that I don't need to say this anymore, but it's worth sort of reminding people that, the reason we're talking about this, the reason this is getting so much attention, isn't just because it is the right good thing to do, but also because it's a business imperative. I mean, research has shown and the data has shown again and again that organizations that embrace diversity, both gender and ethnic diversity, both have higher profits, they have better business performance, and they just overall have stronger reputations, which is something that, our industry should care about very much.
Yeah, absolutely. Any number of management consultancies like McKinsey have been coming out with research saying that it's much better for business that boardrooms that have men and women sitting at the table. And currently, from our research this year, we found that men occupy 62% of the seats at the PR boardroom table. So there's still a long way to go. And also in the public relations industry, it's widely reported, particularly amongst recruitment companies, that it's the mid-career women that we're losing. There is a big talent issue. Women are actually dropping out of the industry mid-career. One of the major challenges that the industry is facing is retaining talent and finding good talent at that level. So it's a business argument. It's not just an ethical argument that people should be paid the same. And not forgetting the other element that's really important in terms of having women at that table and women involved in making major decisions in the industry is diversity. And, PR is a creative industry, and we need men and women and people of all backgrounds as part of those teams. And then in agencies, when you have the more diverse teams, you get more creative results, because obviously you've got very different attitudes and mindsets looking at programs, developing programs. One of the interesting events that we put on at the Cannes Festival of Creativity in the summer was on the subject topic actually was flexible working, but we had Charlotte Witt, who's the director of Prime, one of the Weber Shandwick agencies, and she talked about quite passionately, because in Sweden they have a much more open and diverse culture, about the importance on their creative teams of having this very mixed agency team. And it obviously proved very successful for Prime, because they've won more Cannes Lion Gold Awards than any other PR agency in the last 10 years. So I think diversity is really important for the business, for agencies, for the PR industry. And it's something that businesses really ought to sit up and take notice of.
And it seems increasingly like they are. Of course, especially on the corporate side, even if agencies are not quite there. Did you see what HP did earlier this year, which was so interesting? Not earlier this year, it was actually a few weeks ago, a year ago, right? They gave their agencies basically a mandate that you have to increase levels of either of both women on your teams and people of color, and the representation needs to not just be on the team but also at the leadership level. And then fast forward 12 months, and they published the results, and that's a level of accountability that we've never seen before from clients, have we?
I know. No, and actually, their director of comms, Karen Khan, was another speaker at our event last summer, and she was talking about that. So that was incredibly powerful for a client to behave in that way towards their agency, to make sure that they had a diverse team. I thought that was phenomenal and really leading the way.
Do you think this is really what's going to push agencies to take notice, right? Until it's driven, what I've always heard is that until clients start demanding diversity and representation on their teams, it's just going to be more rhetoric than action.
Yeah, I think it's slowly changing anyway, but the progress is really, really slow. But if clients start making a financial imperative for agencies to behave in a certain way, and the agencies want to keep the business, then that, I think, will help accelerate change. I really do. I also think that there is a political imperative here in terms of gender pay, and we've seen it in the United Kingdom this year, because in the United Kingdom it has now become, earlier this year, a legal requirement for companies and organisations to publish their gender pay figures. And I think that's a very powerful move as well, because, it's a name and shame otherwise. And I think if other countries around the world adopted that sort of legal requirement, that will also help in terms of reducing gender pay gap.
Yeah, I think unfortunately the United States has actually taken many steps backwards in this regard recently. And a lot of the equal pay protections that former President Obama had put into place have actually been rolled back under the new administration. So, but it's good to hear that other countries like the UK are continuing to move forward. So let's go back for a minute and talk about the attrition, and women are leaving around the mid-level. And I was wondering if you had any sort of insight around why this is happening. And one of the things that you commonly hear, and there was actually an Atlantic article that ran a couple of years ago on this topic, and of course what we hear again and again is women leave because of work-life balance. And what this research did was they actually, when they went to the organizations that the women left, that was the reason cited, but then they actually went and interviewed the women, and the women actually said the reason they left was they actually didn't feel valued at their organizations, and they didn't feel like there was really a path forward for them at their organizations beyond where they were. So I wanted to get some insight from you around this. Like, what reasons are you hearing about sort of that attrition, that mid-level attrition?
Yeah, I think there's two issues here that I wanted to raise. One is around flexible working, obviously, and the fact that, we all know women take on more of the responsibility of childcare. Women actually do more of the household chores. I mean, our research has come out with this. In fact, I think it was 42% of women claimed they did more than half of the household chores, and only 6% of men. So there's a big difference there. So if you are in a very demanding job and you're putting in a lot of hours, then just juggling it becomes incredibly difficult. So I mean, that's been well documented, and I think that is an issue that companies can also help, because I do feel that flexibility in the workplace is gradually changing a bit. I mean, from our survey, I think we found 70% of respondents were allowed to work flexible hours, and that's very positive. But at the same time, 81% said that they could be just as efficient if they chose the hours they worked. So I think there is a move for women to be able to work from home more and more flexibly, but it hasn't actually gone far enough. I think there's still a number of major organisations, both agencies and non-agencies, where people are working in comms, where you are expected to be at your desk from 9 till 6 or 7. And if you've got children, which is the mid-career level woman, then you just have to go home because you've got responsibilities as a parent as well as a working woman. So I think when women are still taking on more than half the responsibility for childcare, domestic chores, then it's inevitably going to carry on being difficult. But I think society is, again, changing very slowly. So those sort of things, I hope, will gradually improve with time. But the other thing that I wanted to raise, when you talked about women feeling not valued in organisations, I think this ties into another really big issue for women that has also come out of our research last year and this year, and that's the confidence issue. And we've also heard this anecdotally when we've talked to headhunters and recruitment companies. And women are just much less confident in terms of putting themselves forward for promotion, for pay rises than men. Many of the recruitment headhunters that's pointed out that they put a job to a man and 10 skills are required, and the man looks at the list and he probably can do 8 of them, and he'll say, "Yep, I can do it all. It'll be great. Put me forward for the job." And then they say they will show the same 10 skills to a woman. They'll go, "Oh, I don't know. I can only do 8 of these things. I don't think you should put me forward to the job." And that confidence issue, I think, really is holding women back from getting into the boardroom in companies. And I think one way that we need to address this is through successful women as role models. I think women that have actually made it to the top can lead by example and mentor other women at mid-career level. I think this is a really important thing, and I'd like to see this growing more and more in organisations all over the world. And I think, an organisation like ours, Global Women in PR, where we've got networking events, that's a more informal way. But that's also a way that women can help each other by exchanging ideas and motivating each other to go for these higher jobs. Because, I think, your own Holmes Report research has highlighted that I think it's just not one of the top 10 agencies, PR agencies, has got a female CEO, which is appalling when you consider our industry is 2/3 women. That's what makes it all the more shocking that we've got an industry that's dominated by women.
Oh, yes.
And I think we looked, and I think your list of the top 30 global PR agencies, only 78% of CEOs in the top 30 global PR agencies are men, which is shocking, really. One of the encouraging things is that if you start looking at the leadership teams, they do have a more balanced split. Mm-hmm. And women in the PR industry are coming nearer to that 50-50 split. Weber Shandwick has actually done particularly well on this. But the top seats, the CEO and the presidents, is extremely elusive.
Right. And what's encouraging about the boards and about having women serve on, this is where presumably the successors for today's CEOs will be selected from, right? So the more representation women have there, the higher likelihood that they are going to take the top spot. And to be fair, there are a couple of very big agencies where they do have women in number 2 spots. So of course, it's not for certain that these women are going to ascend to the global CEO role, but they're certainly a candidate. Probably in some cases, the strongest candidate for that position. But I want to go back and touch on a couple of things that you talked about. The first was the imbalance on the workload and the fact that women do still, despite a lot of talk about having more egalitarian households, that's not the reality. And I wonder if there are policies that employers and agencies can put into place to encourage households to share the balance a little bit better, or even, to have the load shared more equally. And I wondered if things like having gender neutral parental leave, or even including a paternity leave, or having flex time available for fathers, not just mothers, really sends a signal that, look, this is everybody's responsibility and we shouldn't be placing this burden on women alone.
Oh, I totally agree. I think paternity leave is a big issue in terms of flexible working. And we were speaking earlier about Scandinavia and how they do have 6 to 9 months paternity leave is normal. And we were at the Eco Global Summit last week talking to some Scandinavian PR businessmen, and the men do take paternity leave. And we asked around the room, even in the countries where paternity leave was permitted, a lot of the men just don't take it, even if they're allowed to take it. So it's a kind of cultural issue as well, and it's a social issue. And people look at me as if I'm in the workforce. Well, they think I'm less of a man because I'm taking paternity leave. It's a little bit sad. So, and that is very hard to change because it's in the society and the culture where people work. But things have changed a lot in the last 100 years. When you look back when women didn't even have the vote, things are beginning to change and society is changing. So one would hope that things like shared maternity and paternity leave and responsibility for childcare, I think some of the millennials men are taking on more responsibility. So it's just that we want to accelerate these changes because as women we get frustrated when it doesn't happen as quickly as we would like. But I think it's changing.
Yeah, no, I think the problem is that women are not going to be able to be CEOs if they are still expected to drop if they're the only parent that's still expected to drop everything and run to doctor's appointments or rush out the door at 4:30 because they have to do daycare pickup at 5 or
Yeah.
and I think that's why this is so critical, because if as long as we put that sole burden on women, we can't do everything, right?
No.
And interestingly, I'm based out here in Silicon Valley, and it's become pretty standard out here that that most companies do parental leave. They don't do maternity and paternity leave, and the parental leave tends to be, it's the same for women and men out here. I mean, by UK standards, this will seem low, but it's actually quite generous for the United States. 4 months seems to be the standard, and everyone watches to see whether. When Mark Zuckerberg's child was born, I think it was his first child. Everybody that Facebook has a 4-month parental leave policy for men and women, and the big question was, would Mark take it and show as an example that look, you can be the CEO and still take 4 months off as of paternity leave? And I think he did 2 months. I'll double check that, but I think he sort of split the difference, but did check out for 2 months and just to kind of send the signal that look, this shouldn't just be the responsibility of one gender. The other thing I wanted to ask you about was this confidence gap, and because that really struck me as well in the stats, and I think it seemed like overall confidence was fairly low in the industry. Of course, it was much lower for women than it was for men.
Yeah.
But
go on. Yeah.
I was going to ask you, why do you think that our industry, why do you think there is such a confidence gap, even, across both genders, although, again, it's worse for women? Why aren't people feeling comfortable asking for promotions and raises and not feeling, confident around kind of taking charge of their own careers, I guess?
I don't think this is specifically the PR industry. I think the confidence issue for women is there from a very early age. Mm-hmm. I think that women under the age of 10, I think, if you watch the documentaries and you listen to the medical profession, women don't have the same level of confidence, or girls don't have the same level of confidence as boys in their own ability, even when they're at school age. A girl thinks she underestimates her own ability in terms of exams much more than boys do. I've seen some research on this. So I think that sort of gender inequality in terms of confidence and views on things starts at a very early age, sadly. And that's actually incredibly hard to address because it's there from childhood almost. Mm-hmm. We know that gender stereotyping starts at childhood, and that's often as a result of not just it's society that creates that. But in our survey, it was 26% of women answered that they're not very confident asking for a promotional pay rise, compared to 13% of men. So that's more than a double the number of women are lacking in confidence. And we also asked them about the career ladder. Will you reach the top of the career ladder? 28% of men think they will definitely reach the top of the career ladder, and only 18% of women believe this. So that's a massive difference in terms of, and that's two different things if you think about it. One, the career ladder could be because of what we've been talking about. It could be because they know that they want to have a family and they can't do it all and they can't manage it all, and we get that. But in terms of asking for a promotional pay rise, that's nothing to do with having a flexible work life or being too busy in terms of your work-life balance. It's just not having that inner confidence in your own ability and feeling positive about your own capabilities and abilities in your job. And I think that's very sad that women feel like that. And that's an incredibly difficult thing to change. And that's why I'm saying that I think that where we have got a few very senior women in the PR industry that have made it to the top, women like Karen Van Bergen, like Barry Rafferty at Ketchum, it's great if they can help and advise how they actually got into that position, what they did to make a difference, because there are so few of them. What did they do that was different to actually get to that position? And I think someone like, for example, Sheryl Sandberg in her Lean In not just the organisation, but that book that came out was phenomenal in terms of really straight, hard-hitting dealing with some of these issues face-on. And obviously there are confident women out there working in any business environment, but if you look at the sort of averages, I'm afraid that women aren't really up there and as confident in the same way as men.
Right.
And is this because boys are actually expected by their parents to actually get to the top of the ladder, and women are still expected to have children and be at home? I hate to think so, and I'm hoping that will also change as society changes. But it seems to be from our research that is the case.
Right. No, it seems like, I think there, like to your point, there's been plenty of research that's shown that women are socialized to not be as forward about their accomplishments. And they do tend to be penalized more if they're seen as self-promoters. And to your point about confidence, no, there's a New York Times piece that on this issue, and one example they cited was they actually had somebody ask a room full, a mixed gender room, about if anyone there considered themselves to be breastfeeding experts. And the person that raised his hand was a man who said he would consider himself an expert because he watched his wife breastfeed for 3 months. And I think that goes to show you, right? Like to your point about having 8, checking off some of the checklists, and how men sort of see that versus women. And I think part of it is I think women are still they're penalized not only for speaking up and for having some they're the famous Harvard Business Review study that showed, right? You have 2 CEO case studies, and one you have the CEO's name, Michael, and the other one you have it, Linda, right? When students read both of them, the one where it was Michael, the CEO, it was like, wow, he's got great leadership skills. And when it was Linda, it was like, wow, she's really bossy. She's really aggressive, right? It's just, women just are not rewarded for having those same traits. So I wanted to also ask you about something else that in the New York Times piece mentioned. And I wonder how much, whether you're seeing this or anecdotally you're hearing about this. And they interviewed a bunch of women who were sort of next in line for CEOs, but didn't actually become CEOs. And they were, one of their perspectives was the barriers were so much more deeply rooted than we think. And organizations still fall in the trap of seeing women as dependable, but not visionaries. And so they kind of get steered more towards those roles of sort of keeping the trains running on time. And men are still sort of steered more towards the visionary roles that ultimately take them to the corner office.
I think this is tied in a little bit when you talk about visionary, and you think about entrepreneurs. I think, this is just anecdotally, and you probably feel the same, that I think men sometimes are more risk takers than women. I think women are scared to fail. I think women like to be in a safe working environment where they're ticking a lot of boxes. I think women like to work in a team environment. They feel more comfortable, and I think that's part of that nurturing nature, personality that we have. Whereas I think, as I said, I think men are more, I don't mind taking a risk. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. I'll just move on to the next thing, and I'll get on with it. Whereas I think perhaps women are more scared of failing. I don't know why.
I think but I think I think the data is shown because they're held at a higher standard, right? When a woman fails, it's much more considered to be reflective of her competency. Whereas if a man fails, I do think there is some element of, well, he took that risk, but it didn't work out. But and I think a lot of this is some of these, as the New York Times piece said, just so deeply intrinsic and rooted in organizations where, especially because they're not accustomed to seeing, perhaps because they're not accustomed to seeing women take a risk and fail. So when they do, it's considered to be much more sort of reflective of the gender, right? It's sort of like the last presidential election in the U.S., right? After Hillary Clinton lost, there was this talk of, wow, well, maybe we shouldn't run a woman at the top of the ticket again. Whereas we've had two white men, right, fail. We had McCain and lose in 2008, and then Romney lose in 2012. And there wasn't a conversation afterwards that, maybe white men candidates can't win. But when we had a woman run in that same position, it was suddenly like, wow, this is reflective of the fact that women just are not capable of winning, taking the presidency. So, and I think one of the things actually that Hillary Clinton said in the aftermath of that is she said, you can't underestimate the power of when they saw both of them on stage and they looked at Donald Trump and they said, he looks like somebody who's been president before. And I think to your point about risk taking, I think there is, when you have an organization where you have a certain profile of a person who's always taken the risks, you feel a bit more confident when you have someone else who looks like that, right? Take the risk.
Yeah. By the way, I'm glad you came up with the bossy word, because you see that all the time, don't you? I mean, I hate that word. And
oh gosh, right.
Again, Sheryl Sandberg, wasn't it, that had the ban bossy campaign a year or two ago?
Right.
Because you hear that so much about women, and nobody describes men as bossy in a work environment, do they? They just don't. But if a woman tries to take the lead, make decisions, and delegate and tell people what to do, direct people, she's described as bossy, and it doesn't help. It doesn't help. Using those sort of words doesn't help women in the workplace.
And the socialization, it seems like it starts so young. And now, I mean, I have a 2.5-year-old, or he's almost 3 actually, and we'll be at the park, and I will notice even the way parents talk to their very preschool age daughters is slightly different than the way they talk to their sons. And my husband and I have actually noted this. We have a son, and we'll notice people with daughters, they'll say, that's not nice, or they'll use the word nice a lot. And it starts to make me wonder, like, how early this is socialized, that for girls, it's so important to be nice. Whereas you don't hear parents of sons using the word nice nearly as much as you'll hear the parents of girls.
Yeah. I think it starts at about age 5, 6, 7.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's society imposing gender stereotypes on children at that level. I really do. I think it's as early as that age. So
if it's so ingrained, I mean, if we're looking at things that are socialized over, like, a person's lifetime, it almost gives us, like, hopelessness to it, right? It's like, what can an organization do to at least sort of start reversing some of the effects of that? I mean, to your point, I think Barry Rafferty actually has done an excellent job, and she's actually appeared on this podcast several times talking about this very issue. And I think she's very actively tried to mentor women coming up in our industry. I mean, do we just need more of that to help sort of undo some of this conditioning that a lot of women enter the workplace
with? I think so. And I think the more women actually see role models succeeding, as soon as, when they see women reaching those CEO positions, then they can aspire to that themselves. We're developing with the ECO organisation, of which we're a sector group, we're developing a series of webinars for women, training webinars run by women. And the first one is called Stepping into Leadership, and that is launching later this month, actually. And as part of that, the course trainer has interviewed 3 very successful women in the industry, and they are actually talking about how they what their role was, how they got there, how the path they took to succeed. And I think that the more that other women can see that and learn from that and understand it, I think it sets us targets for ourselves to actually reach those positions. So I think training, and I think organisations can do this as well with training women. We went to see one of the city organisations in London a few months ago, and they were very concerned that they had women that were reaching just under boardroom level, and they just weren't actually getting into being partners in this. And it's a financial agency, so it's predominantly men. So they acknowledged that they had talented women, but it was just getting them to that next level. I also feel that one thing that perhaps, and this is a bit provocative, I think, this comment, I think sometimes women are less interested in the business side of public relations, and by which I mean the financial side, as in making a profit, what's on the bottom line. I think women, the reason there are so many women in the PR industry, and we are 2/3 women, is that we're very, very good at communications and the soft side skills, business skills. And we go into it because we like talking to people, meeting people, we like communicating, but when it comes to looking at a balance sheet, looking at the bottom line, working out profitability, perhaps women are not so comfortable with that and not so interested in it. And you need to have good commercial skills to be in a boardroom and to become a CEO. And I have, anecdotally talked to women who go, but I'm not really interested in the business side of things. I'm only interested in the PR. And that I suspect that could be holding some women back as well.
But on the flip side of that, I mean, we see this industry sees a tremendous number of women entrepreneurs, women who start their own PR agencies. I mean, I think if you look at agencies under 50 million, it's, I mean, probably even if you, maybe even if you looked at under 100 million, but definitely under 50, I think you'll actually see a majority of female owners. So women clearly understand the business and have an aptitude for that, right? I think, and I wonder how much of it is a chicken and an egg thing, right? I assume a lot of people go into public relations with because of that interest in communicating, to your point, both men and women. But I sometimes wonder if the men are steered more towards the business roles because of the stereotype that, oh, well, he's a man, he must be interested in like numbers. And women are kind of steered more towards client management because it's like, oh, well, she's right, and so some part of it is like, it's hard to say that, women aren't as interested in X or men are more interested in Y, because I think so much of it is a lot of these biases that we have that just play themselves out. One thing I did read, and this is actually Lean In did I think it was a Lean In study that showed that women tend to excel at organizations when they're judged by a very straightforward metric, something like how much new business did you bring in, how much revenue do you oversee, or things like that, versus the much more subjective parameters around like, is this person likable, or do they have good leadership skills? What does that really mean, right? I mean, so I think women actually tend to do better when organizations do have more straightforward metrics around how they evaluate, because of a lot of these biases that we've talked about.
Yeah, and of course, a lot of women do set up their own agencies because it allows them more flexibility, which is something I did. I mean, I set up my own agency because I was, I got married, I was going to have children, and I could see working for a big agency wasn't going to give me that flexibility that I needed, which is, I think, why so many PR women start up small agencies and often are working for those small up to medium-sized agencies as CEOs, because they can control their work-life balance. And I think that's a very important point.
Right, and I think on top of that, and the other anecdote I've heard from women who started their own agencies was women generally, or as we've research has shown, have a different leadership style than men. And I spoke to one CEO, and she actually she runs a very successful agency, and she was saying that her leadership style wasn't necessarily valued or appreciated at the big agencies that still had a very masculine style of leadership. And that wasn't the culture she wanted to create. And so she kind of at some point saw that there wasn't really a path forward for her, especially given her style of leadership didn't quite mesh with the mostly male leadership team. So she started her agency, hugely successful and great retention with her team. And it was because... And do you think that's changing? I mean, do you think women's leadership style, because it does tend to differ from men, is being recognized and acknowledged and appreciated at organizations more than it has in the past?
I'm not sure that it is at the very large global organizations, I have to say. I think you're absolutely right. I think we are different, men and women, and I think we have possibly a more nurturing style when it comes to managing our own agencies when we're running smaller businesses like I was, and very loyal staff as well because of that, because you're almost developing a kind of family environment that people want to belong to, they want it to succeed. I felt that when my agency staff were working for me, they really believed in the ethos of the business and wanted it to succeed. Personally, when I was working at one of the top 10 agencies, I felt it was a much more impersonal environment, much more clinical, much more business-like, much more about the bottom line. And I didn't feel as involved. And that it's, as you say, it's a different style of organisation and a different style of leadership that's involved in those organisations. I'd like to think that it's changing right at the top, but I mean, even if you look at the huge global marketing consultancies, beyond PR, but in the advertising and the marketing consultancy world, there are still very few women at the very top there. And I'm afraid I think it's going to be quite a while before things change.
Yeah, I think Maureen Lippy, who of course runs the firm by the same name, she wrote a piece recently, and it was actually really powerful. And one of the things she said was, because women are their style tends to be a bit more empathetic, and they like to connect with people at a personal level. Like, you need to do little things like change how you structure meetings, right? I mean, there should be room for some amount of, I don't even want to call it small talk, right? But connecting at a personal level before jumping right into the business. And she was saying that, when you're talking to your female colleagues or employees, I mean, you really need to leave some time to really ask and be interested in questions like what's going on in your world, sort of creating that more empathetic environment. And the other thing she said, which ties back to something you and I have talked about, is organizations need to stop overvaluing overconfidence. Which I mean, if you really want to see women succeed at your organization, and we know that women just are not socialized to have the same amount of bravado that a man is when they walk into a room, that we need to stop putting so much value on that and actually putting the value on on getting the work done and who's doing it and who's really excelling there, instead of, he walked into a room and he just like owned it.
So that's true. That's the other side of the fact of valuing overconfidence or overvaluing overconfidence. Yes, is equally wrong as women not being confident enough. And you see it in the meeting room environment, in a business meeting all the time. Whereas women are far less likely, and Sheryl Sandberg obviously wrote about this, women are far less likely to speak up. We need to speak out more. We need to be confident around the meeting room table about our own thoughts and beliefs and feel that we have value. And sadly, this doesn't always happen in a business environment. Is there anything else from the research? Actually, I thought one thing that hasn't been talked about very much that stood out to me when I looked through the research was the ageism and the fact that women felt they were more likely. I mean, they were more likely to see that than men. And I was wondering if you had any context around those stats. I think it was 36% of women believe that the PR industry is ageist compared to 25% of the men. Yeah. We thought we'd throw, because last year when we conducted the survey the first time, we didn't ask any questions about ageism. But it was a woman that's setting up Global Women in PR in Germany, Cornelia, who used to run Gwen for Edelman. That's the Global Women's Executive there. Right. She said to us, when she had a look at the questionnaire, she said, why don't you put a question in about age? Because I think that, for women particularly, I think the PR industry is ageist. So we put that question in, and perhaps we weren't that surprised that it did come back that the respondents felt that the industry is ageist. And actually, I remember I made a note of the fact that figure was even higher in North America. It was 44%. So 44% of women in North America. Almost half. And that was the highest of any of them. We had 19 countries doing the survey, and the highest region was North America in terms of ageism. I'm curious, what was the male stat from North America? Because it was 44% of women. What percentage of men? I haven't got that to hand. I'd have to look at the tables. But I'm sure men thought it was ageist as well, but it was a lot lower. Right. Lot lower. So that was interesting. That's very interesting. I think my German colleague obviously thought that it was it was an issue in Germany as well. I can't remember the exact statistics, but I think the industry is more ageist towards women than it is to men. I think that is the case. Right. Sadly. because we're in an image-conscious industry.
Right. Yes, indeed.
I mean, it's well documented. I mean, in the UK, it's well documented on the BBC television channel. There's a lot of work being done. A lot of women are speaking out about this. When newsreaders get to the age of 50 plus, they kind of get sidelined and asked to leave. I don't think it's quite so bad in the US. I think you've got some, in terms of broadcast, you've got some older women presenters.
To some extent, but you do see, I mean, the classic duo, especially on sort of the local news channels, is the gray-haired man who's been there for decades, and he's always coupled with like the 20-something woman. And every time I see that, I just flip the channel because I'm like, I'm not going to support this. And you do see a lot less of it. You almost never see the reverse, where you see the older woman, coupled with the 20-something male. And it's rare to see peers. I think it's rare to see, the older anchor with the with a true peer, right? An age peer, if nothing else. And you even see that with our national shows, right? I mean, the female anchors seem to cycle out a lot more quickly than, the Matt Lauers, who have just been there for ages, right?
And I see, I mean, from traveling around Europe quite a bit, you see it on the European television as well. Whenever you switch on. Right. Absolutely. No, so I think we're an aging population at the moment. And what is going to happen to all the PR managers when they get to 50? I mean, we're going to be working into our 70s because age is going up, and that's very difficult. I think it's difficult for men and women.
This isn't, you're actually giving me an idea, because this is an under, I think, reported issue in our industry. And you're right, we are an aging population. And we do, not only do we, we keep looking at the pipeline, we keep looking at millennials and now Gen Z. And there's such a heavy focus on that demographic in the workplace. And really, at the detriment to the over 40 and certainly over 50. So that's something that I think there might be a story coming on that.
I think so. I think that's going to be the next diversity issue.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Ageism. Because, I think it is. I think the rise of digital has skewered the industry more to younger people, because obviously a lot of the work now is digital in the PR industry. And for people 40, middle-aged plus, then it's very hard to have those sort of skills and to keep up with those. It's not as easy. But I think older people still bring a lot of knowledge and experience that shouldn't be ignored. And again, it's all back to having a diverse team. Right, and I think you're right. Having the 20-something sitting next to a 40 or 50-something working together is really a much more sensible way to go. Yeah. Because if you go, when you walk into a large agency and you look around the open plan or working environment, you see white 20-somethings sitting at desks. That is the industry at the moment. You don't see colour, you don't see older people, you rarely see disabled people, do you? And they're all, university educated,
right.
And predominantly a lot of women.
A lot of women, yeah. You see, yeah. I think
it is. It's not diverse at all.
Yeah, we did a study. I don't know if you saw the research we did a few months ago that said that I think it was our industry is astonishingly white and overwhelmingly female. I think it's the average PR person is a white Caucasian female with a college degree. Yeah. And in the U.S., a third of them are based in New York. So even from a geographical perspective, you're getting, it's very coastal centric, in particular in New York. So this is one thing I'll say about ageism is one thing I've noticed is when a team or an agency is really skewed towards digital, then yes, it skews very, very young. But for the crisis in some of the corporate shops, the gray haired folks are sort of like they're the reassuring presence at the table. I was talking to someone recently, and he runs a crisis firm, and he keeps trying to get his clients to put the same trust in his his team, but they still need him in the room. They still need to have that seasoned person who's been through, decades of crises to be giving counsel, not just sort of the relative newbies. But wow, Angela, I feel like we could talk about this all day. This is such an interesting topic, but we should probably wrap up. Is there anything we have not talked about that you want to mention?
Well, I was just looking at the survey, and one of the things that did come out when we asked about what sector people worked in, men and women, we looked at the split, and men really dominate the technology sector. I think 38% of respondents, the men, were working with technical clients or in the technological industry, compared to 18% of women. So that's more than double. And this sort of struck a chord with me last week at the Eco Global Summit, when a chart was presented on one of the biggest growth sectors in the PR industry, and there it was, technology at the top. And I thought, this isn't good for women, because if there are, we call it in the UK, and maybe you do in the US, we talk about the STEM subject, science, technology, engineering, manufacturing, and these are the subjects that women at school and going into college are not going into. And, if technology is the biggest growth sector in the industry, and women are not working in that sector and are not really coming out with the relevant skills to work in that sector, then this isn't going to be great for women in the future. So that's a bit concerning.
So by technology, does it mean like actually working with implementing technology within an organization, or having clients in the tech sector?
Both, because our survey covered people in agency and people that were working in organizations. It was, did they work, did they have IT clients, technological clients? Were they working on business in the technology sector?
That's actually really interesting, because I don't think it's entirely reflective of Silicon Valley, where women do seem to dominate the technology PR agencies and many of the marketing functions as well. In fact, it's almost to the detriment where because women are so underrepresented in the engineering roles, that there's this assumption you'll hear female engineers say things like, whenever I walk into the room, people assume that I'm the marketing person or I'm the public relations person, because that's where we tend to see more women in technology, that's where women dominate in the tech sector in Silicon Valley anyway, and they are so underrepresented on the actual, in the technical roles.
Oh, well, that's interesting. No, I wasn't aware that that was the case in terms of the PRs over in Silicon Valley, but obviously if you're looking at Google and the larger organizations, there are obviously women are in the minority. So maybe it was because we were looking at cross agency and in-house. Right. It confused the system a little.
Indeed. Well, Angela, this was great, and I think we'll have to get you back on at some point, because it feels like there's so much more to unpack here.
Oh, thank you. It's been really interesting talking to you, and I think it's very important raising these issues, because we want to make the PR industry a better place for women and a better place for business as well in the future. And it's by highlighting all these issues and discussing them and bringing them to the table, then we can start to make some change.
Agreed. Very, very well said. Well, thank you for being on the show today, Angela.
Yeah, thank you, Aarti.
And that concludes another episode of The Echo Chamber. I'd like to thank our guest, Angela Oakes. I'd also like to thank our production team at Marketeers and the sponsor for our podcast, March Communications, that also produces the fantastic podcast Hacks and Flex. And if you have not tuned into that yet, I highly recommend that you do. And we will be back soon with another episode.
You've been listening to The Echo Chamber. Brought to you by the Holmes Report and produced by Marketeers. Sponsored by March Communications, connecting innovation and people.